The Prime Minister's upcoming visit to the Vatican on May 29th is set to be much more than a meeting between two heads of state. Justin Trudeau is expected to ask Pope Francis for a long-awaited apology to Canada's indigenous communities. He'll be fulfilling a recommendation by the official inquiry into decades of horrific abuse that indigenous Canadians suffered at residential schools. That recommendation from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is worded this way. Take a look. We call upon the Pope to issue an apology to survivors, their families, and communities for the Roman Catholic Church's role in the spiritual, cultural, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children in Catholic-run residential schools. The report also demands that the apology be made here on Canadian soil. And that report, by the way, was issued nearly 18 months ago. So, what took so long and why now? Let's take it to our Sunday Scrum. Susan Riley, John Ibbotson, and Denise CLA all joining me in Ottawa. Susan, what do you make of this promise?
And we should add that the Pope's not getting any younger. So I wonder if he's going to be able, never mind even if he's willing, to make the apology on Canadian soil. If he did, it would have to be, I would assume, in the context of a national visit. So who knows how that's going to unfold. These apologies, and we've seen a number of them over the course of the last decade, they can have a profound emotional impact, a positive impact. Certainly, Mr. Harper's apology in the House of Commons did. It seemed to resonate deeply with a lot of Indigenous leaders. That being said, there's a really growing impatience abroad, and you can read about it and see it online and see it everywhere among Indigenous activists. And I think, you know, yes, the apology is fine, but what next is the question. And in the context, in the shadow of this announcement about the Pope, we see the inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginal women sort of almost falling apart, imploding. There's a lot of dissatisfaction about how that inquiry is going and a lot of disappointment. I really think we're on the edge of returning to a kind of bitter divide that's always characterized relationships between Canada and the original people. Returning to, I mean, you know, anyway. So I'm not sure how much impact this will have if it happens.
Do you think, John, that this is the reason that the Prime Minister is doing this now, that something needs to be done? A gesture?
I assume it is. These trips are negotiated only after the fact. So, you know, I don't think that Justin Trudeau would go to the Vatican not knowing whether Pope Francis was going to agree to issue an apology or not. There must be some kind of an accord already in place, which they will announce. And it may involve, as Susan mentioned, Pope Francis traveling to Canada and issuing the apology. But I think Susan makes a far bigger and more worrying and more valid point. There was a lot of tension between First Nations leaders and the Harper government. But in a way, it was almost a safety valve. You could blame Harper for this, you could blame Harper for that. You could say that the Conservatives didn't care, the Conservatives were mean and nasty and all sorts of other things. But now you have a Liberal government that's specifically dedicated to reconciling the divisions between First Nations and the rest of Canada, and it's failing. The Murdered and Missing Aboriginal Commission is doing exactly what everyone predicted it would do, which is moving with glacial speed and accomplishing almost nothing. You have the question of boiled water advisories. We still have so many reserves that don't have proper drinking water. And you have the question of pipelines versus Aboriginal rights land claims, which the Trudeau government appears to be prepared to abandon in order to get those pipelines built. So we could be heading towards a serious breach between the First Nations and the rest of Canada. And whether Pope Francis comes here and says he's sorry, I think is small change compared to the bigger issues that we're facing.
Okay, so that breach, some might argue the breach already exists. It's just about, the question is, how will it manifest itself in the future?
Here's my take on it, and I would echo both Susan and John. And actually, let's talk about this word reconciliation, because reconciliation also means a remedy. So 94 recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is one of them in terms of an apology from the Pope. But the Pope is not in a position to effect change on the ground in Canada. This is up to the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops to sort of take what the Pope has said now and look at ways to engage our Indigenous communities more thoroughly. What I want to know and hear, in fact, is, as I think about the MMIW, Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls inquiry, what's that step? And what of the other 90 recommendations that are around health, education, the justice system? There is so much more. This apology from the Pope is spiritually, it's a healing. But then, as Susan very well said, what comes next? And this is, in my view, not necessarily a role for the Vatican, but it is for not only the Canadian government in conjunction with the Indigenous communities, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis councils, but also religious and faith communities from across the board to talk and action what reconciliation really looks like. And I want to see what's more here rather than just, like, let's talk about the remaining 90 plus recommendations on the table from the TRC.
But the fact that this was a recommendation on the TRC indicates that it is a fairly important step for the reconciliation process if it was included. But what strikes me, I'm just going to stay on the format of it for a moment. I know you're saying there are bigger issues, and we can tackle those again in a second. But what I mean when I say that it's fluid, a government official said the following during a technical briefing for the media ahead of the trip. Here's what he had to say: "It's a conversation that's going to have to happen between the two gentlemen. Obviously, the Vatican is well aware of the TRC request, and they know that's something that we will be raising. But in terms of advancing that conversation, I think it's going to have to happen in the room." So, John, to your point, it doesn't seem like it has that normally worked out idea that you see when two heads of state normally get together, that it's all done in advance and it's a matter of formality when they actually meet. It seems like it's something that the Canadians are pushing.
Yeah, but with respect, I don't fully believe the background official. Canada would never allow a situation to arise in which its head of government met another head of state to discuss an important issue in which neither side, in which our side did not know how the other side was going to respond. We may not know the measure of the response, whether it will be a statement, a press release of apology, or whether it will be a full-fledged mass on Canadian soil followed by an apology, or whether it will be something in between. So the details have to be worked out. But I don't think that Justin Trudeau would go and make this request and then simply hear from the Pope, "No, I'm not prepared to say I'm sorry in any way, shape, or form whatsoever," and then walk out of the room and shrug and say, "Well, I tried." That's just not going to happen.
All right.
I don't think it'll happen.
We will leave.
I've got to throw this in there.
Yes, please do.
You know, that statement, it's two gentlemen in a room, and we are talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands of our Indigenous Canadians who are looking at this and saying, this is not a conversation between two gentlemen. It is a conversation about nation-to-nation relationships. So I'll leave that there to say there's a lot more to it than the Pope maybe making an apology, whether it's on Canadian soil or not. It has to be part of a wider response, not only from the Catholic Church, but also the Canadian government.